Hello and welcome to In the Light, Growing Your Soul with me, Anna Isabel. I'm a clinical hypnotherapist and I have the pleasure of the company of Jerry Hyde, who is an author, therapist, and filmmaker. Welcome, Jerry.
Hi, thank you.
So I've been reading your book, Empathy for the Devil, and I think perhaps we might start with the title. Explain.
When you get into the therapy world, or certainly when I did, which is like 300 years ago now, people, one of the first things people would tell me is, well, you've got to learn to love yourself. And I understood that intellectually, but it didn't make any difference for a long time. And I think it was when I realized that loving yourself has to be unconditional. Therefore, what Jung called the shadow, the darker sides, the things that, the shadow is a misunderstood thing in itself, because people think it's your evil side or your greed or your rage or your murderous side or what have you. It's actually everything that you're blind to. So it can be your brilliance as well, which is a terribly unpopular thing to acknowledge if you're British. We're not supposed to be good at anything. Boasting is a terrible sin for in our culture. But I think that to me is what the title refers to. It's okay if you want to be whole. Jung said, "Do you want to be good or whole?" I think it's a good question. If you want to be whole, and who doesn't, then you have to have a lot of empathy for those parts of yourself that maybe aren't as palatable.
Indeed. And I think that's one of the reasons why when I first looked at the introduction for your book, I thought, okay, this is good, because it is looking at those recesses that we want to hide, which is exactly what therapy is all about. You can't, and what you said, which is so true, it has to be unconditional. It has to be accepting yourself. In all the myriad of colors. And it's a very important thing, because otherwise you can't get self-acceptance, let alone self-love. And you're right, when clients approach me, getting to that point of self-acceptance, let alone the scaly heights of love, it's a journey. It's a really hard thing.
Yeah, there's a quote attributed to the Buddha. He apparently said, "Love yourself and watch," and that's probably the most useful thing I've ever learned, is practicing that. I suppose it's not. I do think it's an art. I think it's an art you have to, or a talent, or a craft perhaps, that you have to master when you go into therapy. It's not, you don't just show up and get fixed by some clever person. You have to learn how to work on yourself, and watching yourself from a self-compassionate place is the most useful tool I've learned. There's no end to that journey, but to always be curious, okay, so I don't feel too proud of how I behaved yesterday, but what was going on? And to have the compassion to not disappear into self-loathing. The minute you go into self-loathing, you don't want to look at yourself. Most people will find ways to distract away from that, because it's very painful. Whereas if you can adopt a bit of dispassionate curiosity, then there's a chance you might learn something, and then you up the odds of not repeating that behavior if you don't like it too much, or maybe finding out it's not so bad.
I think there's so much in this. It's such a dense topic, because we clearly want to have some sense of right and wrong, because we don't want to be harming other people. But at the same time, we have to be aware that everyone is capable of harming others to a greater or lesser extent. And most people get by in life just accidentally harming. But it's really important that we understand that if we don't want to acknowledge and I'm just going to borrow from your title, the devil within us, then it's going to do things that we don't want to own. And at its most extreme, we then blame others for the very things that we are doing. And I think we can look at it as the abuser who wants to justify what they've done by blaming the victim. But we don't have to look too far, sadly, in our time to see how much judgment is out there, and how judgment also is a part of that shadow that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and I find, most statements, if I say or think a mean thought about someone or make a judgment about someone, if I take the time to turn that into an I statement, it normally stands up. So if I think that person is a selfish, mean, horrible person, then I go, okay, I'm a selfish, mean, horrible person. It's never going to be untrue. There's often, times I can behave with all those behaviors. So understanding a little bit about the basics of projection is enormously important, because it's we all do it all the time. It's how we interface with other human beings. It's how we relate to other people. It's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just how we operate. And it's funny, I always use this example. I'm not a fan of Star Wars, especially. It's not my favorite film, but as an archetypal story, it's a good one. And we are all Darth Vader and we're all Luke Skywalker, and that's why we enjoy these films, because we see the light and the shade. We see the different aspects of humanity and the human spirit reflected back to us, and we like hating the bad guy and we love cheering for the hero, but they're both us. If you don't realize that, then the world becomes very polarized, which I think we're seeing more than ever. Good guys, bad guys. It's not the healthiest way of looking at things, though.
No, it isn't. So tell us a little bit more about, because we're talking about projection. So tell us about projection.
I think projection is the disowned self often. You can do it. I'm advocating doing it with consciousness, but it's a very, very good way to get to know ourselves, which is a notoriously difficult thing to do. That's why we go and see therapists, or we ask people we trust, for reflections on ourselves. It's hard to see ourselves. But I think anything that you see in another person, that everyone's a mirror, right? There's 7.5 billion mirrors out there. And the people that you love, the people you hate, tend to have bigger mirrors. The people you feel indifferent to, or the film characters, or the characters in literature that don't connect you. Like I say, Star Wars isn't a big one for me, but most people know who those characters are. But the ones that you feel indifferent to, probably not so much of yourself to be reflected back, but the people you have strong reactions to, they're almost certainly going to be aspects of yourself that you're ignoring, and that can be Mother Teresa and it can be Adolf Hitler. It doesn't really matter which end of the spectrum. Most people who work with the shadow will tell you that it's actually, interestingly, it's easier to get people to admit their dark side than it is to admit their brilliance. As I was saying earlier, there's a cultural thing, particularly in Northern Europe and Britain. But I think it's, America's not so bad. America has the American dream, and they have they're not ashamed of success in America. Whereas in Britain, it's considered rather poor taste, to be successful. And certainly if you do become successful, you don't talk about it. Probably don't admit it to yourself. You don't talk about it. You don't really want to be too showy in your displays of success or wealth. It's considered rather vulgar. So we squash that kind of thing. And I think that's rather limiting. There's plenty of things in American culture that a lot of people are upset about at the moment, but some of the fundamentals, like their belief that you can succeed and that the small person can become president or can achieve, I think it's a very healthy way of being, and we might want to take some lessons from that.
Yes, I think that there's a lot of clients often apologize to me when they admit to being good at something. And I always feel a bit like a cheerleader going, no, it's wonderful, because of wanting to counterbalance that and say, no, actually own the things that you are, as you said, brilliant at. It's important that we have that whole spectrum.
I'll shame people. I'll guilt trip people. I have no pride whatsoever if it comes to trying to help people be better. I'll exploit their self-critic and I'll make them feel bad, because I think if you've given a gift, I'm not religious, but it's kind of almost quasi-religious. I say, if you've got a gift, it's not yours. It's not yours to keep to yourself. You've been given a gift. Your job is to share it. You keep it to yourself, then it's probably going to turn bad. It's probably going to turn dark. So don't think that that's all yours to keep hidden away. You have a kind of, again, I'm not into morality particularly, but I kind of lean on people a little bit and go, you do have a kind of moral, obligation here to use this gift to make the world a better place. And if everyone does that, the world would be a better place. I think we're too cautious about being seen to be showing off.
Absolutely. And I have been known to say similar things. And I think sometimes what we're dealing with is a fear. Well, often what we're dealing with is a fear of rejection. If I do the wrong thing, I'm going to be rejected. But then also, if I do too much of the right thing, then I'm also going to be rejected because of jealousy, etc. So it's really important that actually I think what we can sum up what we're talking about as honesty, the honesty of understanding who we are, the bright side, the dark side, everything in the middle, and then being able to have the courage to live with integrity and follow our path to the best of our ability.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the difficulties, they get kind of imprinted on us in classrooms. I think you're right. When I was always the stupid kid sitting at the back of the class, but I've worked with enough people who were the kind of grade A students, and they got a lot of crap from people for exactly what you're saying, from jealousy, or because it showed up the other kids. Just a competitiveness. And I think we need to look at the way that we're educating kids. That's a whole podcast episode in itself. But yeah, I'm not a fan of super competitive or grading kids or comparing kids. I think I understand why they want to instill that in us, but there's some big downsides to how competitive we are as opposed to when we collaborate.
Well, there's a price to be paid for everything, and the hothousing of children, which is geared towards getting them to pass exams rather than to actually allowing them to develop as human beings and to learn and explore the world, has a very high price indeed.
Yeah. I mean, my ex-wife and we took our kids out of school, and I think they benefited from, particularly as all kids got taken out of school a couple of years ago anyway, but they benefited from homeschooling and were better prepared for the whole lockdown thing that happened, certainly.
Going back to your book, what prompted you to write it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I never know. With books. They kind of show up and demand to be written, which sounds a little grandiose, but I do feel that they have a personality of their own, and like I don't have anything in me to write at the moment. I've got no desire, no need, no impulse to write at all, and I doubt that will stay that way. It kind of comes upon me, and I'm not the best writer in the world at knowing what I'm even writing for or about. And I was kind of encouraged to hear Stephen King say he never knows what the end of his book is. That's what motivates him to write. He's the first person who's experiencing the story, whether it's Carrie or The Shining or whatever, and he wants to find out what happens at the end just as much as anyone else. And I like that because I have no idea what I'm writing about half the time. And in fact, the writing part is quite a small part. It's the trying to sculpt it, this raw material that I end up with. It's trying to take this lump of clay and mold it into something that has meaning or value to other people. And with this book, I actually ditched it. I must have written it 5 or 6 times, and then I ditched it and thought this was just an essay for myself. And then I went back to it after a few months and thought, no, I think there may be some value to other people in this. But it's always a piece of personal work for me. It's something that I'm trying to work through in myself. And this one was it went into different areas. That's why in the end I divided it into 3 parts: sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But I learned an awful lot in all 3 of those areas, particularly around sex and sexuality, which was a pretty shadowy exploration that benefited me enormously. Hopefully, other people will follow that process, because I've given kind of explorations to do at the end of each chapter in the hope that other people may get something from it. But I think, if you work through your sexuality, not through, because I don't think there's an end point, but if you work with your sexuality, then you're going to be a more whole person, that's for sure, because it's shadowy as fuck.
So many thoughts were going through my mind then, just listening to you. Firstly, I understand what you're saying, it just kind of arrives. I think we can get moved to do things. And there's often something that moves me into action. And so I think that I can understand what you're saying about, a book is either in you or it isn't at any particular moment. It's that spark of inspiration. Something happens and suddenly you're off. I think just reading, what I felt about your book is that it's very raw. And it's raw because we're talking about things that are raw. But I liked the way in which you consider how things come to be considered as shameful that are otherwise a natural part of being human. And how it's important to understand that, because if we don't, then it does get driven into the shadows and can be extremely damaging to ourselves. And in the more extreme cases, of course, it leads to the damage of others as well.
I mean, shame's a fantastically powerful weapon if you want to control people. And so if you shame people around, you shame people around anything, but sexuality is such a delicate, vulnerable thing, and it often clashes with religious beliefs, as opposed to pagan beliefs. Christian beliefs and pagan beliefs are pretty polar. And I was raised in a Christian culture as a Christian. It's something I walked away from quite early on. But nevertheless, whether you're religious or practicing or not, the culture you will absorb the culture. And so I think it creates an awful lot of pain and anguish for people, and abuse. I was at another book that I wrote a few years ago. I was doing some research and I was looking at sin, and for some reason I ended up Googling incidents of sex abuse in the Church of Satan. 0. Incidents of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. Of something like 20 million on Google. So I think,
we'd have to ask ourselves, though, is that a fair comparison? Because what would the Church of Satan consider to be acceptable or not acceptable? Are they going to be the same parameters as the rest of society? So I think we have to be a bit careful when
Church
we're making
Satan's
that comparison.
Church Satan's pretty cool. I got to say, I didn't come out Satanist, but it's, you know, again, this is another podcast perhaps, but it's very misunderstood. And when I went and looked at their kind of ethical approach to life, it was pretty much what we've already talked about, which is don't harm other people. You know, they don't actually believe in Satan. You know, that I think they're being provocative mostly in that. But you know, where you've got repression, you have stuff that's hidden. Where stuff is hidden, then people are blind to themselves and their darker sides, and then you have problems. You know, it's that energy has to go somewhere.
Exactly. And that's very clearly why it's so important that we have the honesty. I think one of the things that you talk about, which I think is something that comes up relatively frequently, is how could supposedly good people allow evil to flourish as it did in Hitler's Germany, etc. The answer is very simple, isn't it?
It's people. You know, it's people. It's what people have always done. Who knows? Maybe it's what people will always do. We've always oppressed other people. The more powerful have always oppressed the less powerful. Genocide is part of our species history as far back as you go, and I think there's a I have to choose my words carefully here. I don't want it to come out wrong, but I think there's a kind of terrible Western European arrogance in our shock that it could happen here, because surely that only happens in, you know, darkest Africa or in, you know, far off continents where uncivilized people behave. And the fact it happened in industrialized Europe in the, you know, within the last 100 years is shocking to us, because you have to go, oh shit, we are those people. Yeah.
And it's really important we understand that. Because if we don't understand that, we will never be vigilant. And it will happen again. And it will happen again on our doorstep. So we have to always know that when we say it's okay, this is a small infringement. And we say it's okay because this is only a small infringement. And it accrues and it accrues. Oh, it's only the Jews. And after all, and, you know, they say that they're dirty, and it begins with a campaign, a health campaign, to ostracize them, to say that they carry disease. But that's okay, because it's just them. And after all, we don't want to be diseased. When we begin to allow that to happen, the danger spreads. And so when we ask, how is it possible that good people allowed Hitler to flourish? We always need to remember that these things don't just happen. They happen slowly in increments. And it's how much are we willing to tolerate and collude that allows it to happen.
Yeah, and even the kind of notion of good people and bad people is a delusion in itself. You know, there's certainly people who do things that shock us and that we consider inappropriate, and quite rightly so. And there are people who make incredible gestures of goodness towards society, but there's no such thing as good people and bad people in the end. You know, and the people we judge as bad people, I often feel they've become scapegoats that make us feel better about ourselves. It's like, look at those mass murderers or those pedophiles. Yes, the behavior should not be tolerated, but it kind of the us and them nature of it, rather than, you know, I asked some very difficult questions in the book, like, for example, you know, do all people who are are all abusers, are all sexual abusers, have they, have they all been abused, and is that an inevitable chain? And I looked at my own history of being abused, and I looked at how I've been transgressive in my boundaries. Sure, I haven't raped or molested anyone, but I think most of us, if we look at our sexual history, we'll probably find areas either where we've allowed things to happen to ourselves, or we've behaved in ways to other people where, as we've developed and matured, we've looked back and thought, I mean, I've objectified women. I've not, I've been more driven by my own pleasure or my own desire than I have considered what they may want. And these are very, very difficult questions to face in ourselves. In the end, I think the answer I came to was no, I'm not a sexual abuser, but I think all people who have been sexually abused, which is a lot more people than most people would realize, depending on how you qualify sexual abuse, but all people who've been sexually abused struggle to receive love. And when you can't receive love, then you're already separate. You're already a bit shut down and desensitized and less able to give love. And that causes immense problems in terms of compassion and empathy. So these inquiries need to be encouraged, even though they can be very difficult and scary and painful, because no one wants to find out, oh shit, what if I'm one of the bad guys? I had someone approach me recently saying, oh, I've seen your profile and I represent a bunch of coaches, and we're very worried about the quality of coaching in this country. We think there's some very bad coaches out there. And I wrote back and I said, but how do we know we're the good ones? How do you decide we're the good ones? Are you aware that in the last two wars, the Germans had on their belt buckles, they had "God is with us" on their belt buckles. Everyone thinks they're the good guys. What if we're not? And the conversation ended fairly soon afterwards. He felt rather offended by that. But it's like, I don't know that I can say I'm the good guy. I can't say I'm the bad guy. I'm just a guy trying to do my best.
Yes, and there is an example of a group of people who are wanting to regulate and control, and who decides what's right and what's not right according to the regulations they want to put in place. This is always the danger for all of us, and we have to always keep our eyes wide open. So good answer. I like that.
I mean, yeah, I'm convinced. I never met the guy, but I'm convinced if you met Hitler, he wouldn't have said, yeah, I think we're up to some fairly nefarious shit. He would have said, this is for the good of society or civilization. Donald Trump, the same. I don't believe Donald Trump's a liar. I think he's an awful lot of terrible things, but I don't think he's a liar, because I think he believes his own bullshit. I think he believes that he's on the side of the good or the right. And I happen to disagree with him. That doesn't mean that I'm right and he's wrong. But the minute you get super aligned to you are the good person, then everyone else has to become the bad people. And then we're in a kind of war zone.
Exactly. So this is, it's asking those hard questions. This is the reason why it takes a great deal of, I guess, courage is a word we could use to have therapy. I think many people would go into therapy not because they feel particularly courageous, but more because they are on their knees and rather desperate for help. But it does take courage, because there are those who never even ask for help, because they don't want to face their own judgment of themselves. So this is the, I'm going to say, the beauty of working to help people through that very sometimes tortuous process. And I like that your book is a reminder of why we should all do that.
Yeah, I mean, I went to therapy in my 20s thinking, well, I'll go and do a couple of sessions and sort myself out. And I'm 57 now and I'm still going. I'm still doing that work, and I accepted a long time ago. It's a never-ending journey, and it's one that I don't do because I'm desperate like I was then any longer, but I do it because I still want to be accountable. I still want to evolve. I still want to treat the people who, amazingly still treat me with love and respect. I want to be able to reciprocate. And I have bad days when I think I'm a, horrible, cold, selfish, distant person. And I'm curious about that. I don't feel like, oh, I'm the worst person because I can be distant or standoffish or mean. I'm curious, like, okay, so what's what's making me this way? One of the things that I like to look at with myself and clients is, rather than looking at things as problems, like to look at them as solutions. So what is my system imagining I'm solving by being distant from people? Well, obviously it's a defense mechanism. It's a protection mechanism that got established a long time ago, that perhaps I can replace with something more effective, or something more conscious. So I think I've shifted over the years from problem solving into just trying to tweak and polish my solutions, because they don't always work for me or the people around me so well.
Well, it's a process. I think that really to look into a mirror and reflect upon what we see is something that is a life's process. And sometimes that's more effectively done with the help of another, which is of course the value of therapy. And so it's as you said before, it's not necessarily that there's an end result that you're looking for. For some people, yes, I'm afraid of flying, please help me. I'm afraid of this, please help me. There's a very targeted, specific thing that you're looking at. But in my experience, when I'm working with clients and they come even with a very specific goal, we often find that there is a lot underneath that, which we let's say creates for rich mining experience. So it's always a process. And so yes, indeed, it's, again, I think that's the value of a book like yours, because it helps us to remember that.
Yeah, therapy's shifted. When I started in the early 90s, it was definitely seen as a problem-solving system for people who weren't very well, whereas I think we've accepted it as a lifestyle choice now, like going to the gym. And to me, it's no different. It's you don't go to the gym because you've got an injury necessarily. You go to stay healthy. Well, why wouldn't you go to therapy in a kind of preemptive way, rather than waiting for the wheels to fall off?
Well, it's as I say, it's always good to it's good to begin with a good book to ponder on this, and see where we go from there. And the book that we have been discussing today is Empathy for the Devil. And Jerry, thank you so much for joining us on In the Lights today.
Oh, thank you for your time. It's been great.
And thank you for watching.